In August 2025, the Ford Carrier Strike Group had been doing what American sailors had done there for 40 years, keeping the North Atlantic open so IKEA furniture could reach American living rooms. Everything was fine until a circling aircraft detected something that would trigger the most intense submarine hunt since the Cold War. Unknown to the Americans, the Russians had just received orders from the Northern Fleet close with the Americans and collect everything. Moscow was about to learn why challenging the U.S. Navy in the Atlantic is about as smart as telling your wife she has gained 10 pounds. Inside the Ford's Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer watched the submarine's vectors with the calm that comes from having 4 Arleigh Burke destroyers nearby, each carrying enough ordnance to turn any submarine into an artificial reef. At the Russians' current speed, they would reach torpedo range in exactly 47 minutes. The math was simple for the Russians. Their torpedoes would cover the remaining distance in under 6 minutes once launched. But the Ford's escorts had ASROC's anti-submarine rockets that could reach them in about 90 seconds. At 15:03, the admiral wanted to know the probable intent of the Russian boats. The answer was obvious. At their current speed and heading, they would be within intelligence collection range in 40 minutes. The recommendation was to go to general quarters. The admiral's response was pure American confidence. Let's see how badly they want to embarrass themselves first. That assumed the Russians could even maintain their approach undetected. Within seconds, Link 16 automatically shared the submarine data across every NATO asset in the region. What happened next was like watching a SWAT team respond to someone trying to rob a lemonade stand. A British Type 23 frigate, conducting exercises 50 miles to the north, immediately turned south at flank speed. 8 P-8 Poseidons scrambled from bases in Scotland, Norway, and Iceland, each one a $130 million submarine hunter that could probably hear a shrimp sneeze at 500 meters depth. A Virginia-class submarine, which had been shadowing the Russians since they left port 3 days earlier, finally got permission to make her presence felt. At 15:15, the tactical picture went from interesting to comedy gold. The Russians executed what they thought was a clever deception. One sub ascended to 200 meters, making deliberate noise, while the other 2 went deep, trying to slip in undetected. Classic Wolfpack tactics from 1943. Except this was 2025, and NATO's acoustic processors could tell the difference between a noisy decoy and 2 quiet submarines that sounded like a broken wheel on a shopping cart. The Russians were not just being aggressive, they were attempting a coordinated intelligence operation that would have been cutting edge in 1985. They wanted to record the Ford's acoustic signatures map her escort formations and catalog radar emissions, all valuable intelligence if you are planning to fight the U.S. Navy. The problem for the Russians was that they had no idea what was coming next, as multiple ships and aircraft converged on their position like a swarm of Karens descending on a restaurant manager. By 1500 hours, the first P-8 Poseidon arrived overhead, and the 3 Russian submarines were about to learn what hammering meant in NATO terms. The P-8 is a Boeing 737 that gave up carrying tourists to Florida, so it could become the world's most sophisticated submarine hunter. It costs around $130 million and can hear a dolphin argue with its spouse at 500 meters depth. The P-8 started its work by dropping sonobuoys in what is called a boxing pattern. These DI-CAS buoys, directional command-activated sonobuoy systems, are basically underwater microphones that scream at submarines until they give up their position. Each one costs more than most Russians make in a year, and NATO was throwing them overboard like they were going out of style. Each buoy started pinging active sonar at about 140 decibels. For reference, that is louder than a gunshot. And it is happening inside a metal tube. Imagine being locked in a shipping container while someone plays drums on the outside forever. Inside the Kazan, the first ping hit, like someone had turned their submarine into a giant bell, and the rock had just taken a swing. The sonar operators ripped off their headphones so fast they probably needed neck surgery. Their beautiful, silent service reputation was gone. They were now the loudest thing in the ocean, like a Harley-Davidson at a meditation retreat. Every 30 seconds, ping. No escape, no relief, just ping. While the Russians were running in circles, the P-8 crews were living their best life. Fresh crews every 4 hours, actual food that was not served through a tube, bathrooms that did not share space with nuclear missiles. They were basically operating from a flying we work, while the Russians were trapped in the underwater equivalent of a Spirit Airlines middle seat. But the U.S. Navy was just getting started. It was time for the Arleigh Burke destroyers to earn their paychecks. They activated their hull-mounted sonar, a bow-mounted spherical array containing hundreds of transducers that listen for echoes bouncing off submarines like underwater radar, and joined the acoustic assault. These systems can pump out so much acoustic energy that fish near the ship can literally be stunned. The Russians were not just being hunted. They were experiencing what happens when America decides to use the ocean as a concert speaker. Then came the simulated attack runs. P-8s dove from 25,000 feet, screaming toward the surface as if they were about to drop weapons. The Russian submarine crews, already running on no sleep, had to assume each run might be real. Emergency blow ballast, hard rudder. It was like someone playing that hand slap game where they fake you out 50 times in a row. You flinch every time, even when you know they are just messing with you. The Kazan tried the submarine equivalent of flooring it in a police chase, a 30-knot sprint to break contact. The OK-650V reactor pushed about 43,000 horsepower through the water, which sounds impressive until you realize that it made them sound like a washing machine full of hammers being thrown down an elevator shaft. So why would the Russians put up with all this punishment? Look at the radars on the Ford's mast. Every radar has a fingerprint-specific frequencies, pulse patterns, and power levels. Get that data, and you can develop jammers to blind it. The Russians were recording the entire electromagnetic spectrum, cataloging every emission. The carrier launches aircraft roughly every 90 seconds during flight ops. That pattern tells you crew shifts, maintenance windows, and vulnerability periods. They were mapping which escorts used which data link channels, how the formation communicated, building a digital blueprint of American carrier operations. This intelligence could help them design specific weapons and tactics to attack carrier groups. Except NATO was not about to let them finish their homework assignment. All 3 submarines launched acoustic decoys devices designed to mimic submarine sounds and confuse pursuers. NATO's response was beautiful. Their computers classified each decoy in about 1/3 of a second, basically saying, "That's cute," and maintained perfect tracking on all 3 real submarines. It was like watching someone try to escape the cops by throwing a mannequin out of their car, while the police have helicopters, satellites, and your license plate number. And it was only going to get worse. By hour 24, NATO had turned submarine hunting into performance art. A British ship arrived with her Type 2087 towed array sonar, dragging 2 kilometers of hydrophones behind her basically underwater listening devices. MH-60 Romeo helicopters started taking shifts, hovering 50 feet above the water and lowering their dipping sonar in search of the subs. The Russians tried to hide using thermocline's underwater temperature layers that can bend sonar beams. Too bad dipping sonar goes straight through them. It was like trying to hide from your wife behind a glass door. Despite how easy the aircraft made it look, the coordination required was insane. and one mistake could put aircraft or ships in each other's way. NATO divided the airspace into blocks. P-8s from 20,000 to 25,000 feet heli. Helicopters below 500 feet with 5,000 feet of vertical separation and carefully controlled lateral spacing. Each nation was assigned specific radio bands, Americans on UHF British, on VHF Norwegians, on both, because someone had to translate. Every aircraft had an assigned patrol box like an aerial parking space, and you needed permission from the airborne controller to leave your box. The controller was juggling aircraft from 3 nations, all with different capabilities and limitations. The Data Fusion Center at Northwood combined sensor feeds from all platforms in real time, creating a 3-dimensional picture of the battle space that looked like the world's most expensive video game. But this was not a simulation. It was real, and NATO sailors were having a grand time at the Russians' expense. Helicopters hovered directly above the submarines, lowered their sonar, and started pinging. The Russian crews could probably feel it in their teeth. Meanwhile, the Arleigh Burke destroyers were not just using their hull sonars. They also deployed their AN/SQR-19 towed arrays, dragging their own sets of underwater microphones to catch any sound the Russians made. Rumor has it, one Russian submariner asked his captain if they could just surface and apologize, because the pings were making his stomach hurt. The Russians were not simply being hunted. They were experiencing what it feels like when America decides to turn the ocean itself into a speaker system. Soon, the submarines had more sonar contacts on their screens than a Kardashian has notifications on Instagram. With P-8s overhead helicopters at medium altitude and surface ships all around, this was no longer a hunt. It was a smackdown. NATO had turned the Norwegian Sea into a 48-hour EDM festival where Russia could not find the exit and the base never stopped. And here is the beautiful part. Remember that Virginia-class submarine we mentioned? For 48 hours, this American submarine maintained perfect trail position using her TB-34 towed array sonar running so quietly on electric drive that she was basically a ghost with torpedoes. The crew watched it all unfold like a Netflix documentary titled "Making a Submariner: Why Russia Can't." They recorded every sound, every evasive maneuver, every desperate attempt to break contact. The Russians tried everything, hiding in underwater canyons only for NATO helicopters to hover directly overhead with dipping sonar like fishing in a barrel, changing depth radically only to find that the destroyer sonars could track them from the surface to the seabed. Sprint and drift tactics. But the American sub matched every move like a dance partner who knew the routine better than they did. At one point, the Virginia's captain decided to send a message. One quick pulse of active sonar from the BQQ-10 bow array. Not enough to give away exact position, but enough to let the Russians know they had been followed the entire time. Imagine being stalked by John Cena for 2 days. You cannot see him, but he is definitely there, and occasionally you just hear, "You can't see me," echoing in the dark. By day 2, P-8 crews had developed a system. They timed sonar pings to disrupt REM sleep cycles, just as the Russian crews started to drift off ping. It was like having a roommate who sets an alarm every 5 minutes and never gets out of bed. After 48 hours of that, those sailors were probably seeing colors that do not exist and talking to people who were not there. And it still was not over. Desperate to break contact, the 3 Russian submarines used every trick in the Soviet handbook, which would have been impressive if it were still 1982, and NATO had not written most of that handbook. Bottoming out on the seafloor, the P-8s switched to magnetic anomaly detection. Radical depth changes, destroyers had them covered from the surface down. Launching every remaining decoy NATO systems, cataloged them like Pokemon cards. Got to catch them all and label them useless. After several more hours, the Russians finally learned that trying to break contact with NATO in the Norwegian Sea is like trying to lose the IRS during tax season. They know where you are going, and how much you owe. The Russians aborted their intelligence mission, which in military terms means they ran away while pretending that was the plan all along. They withdrew north, still submerged, probably composing reports about a successful reconnaissance operation that definitely did not include 48 hours of acoustic abuse. NATO maintained contact as they retreated like bouncers escorting someone out of the club. P-8s followed them partway to ensure they actually left, and frankly, to rub it in a little. Everyone knew what had happened, but everyone kept up appearances. During those 48 hours, NATO collected enough acoustic intelligence to recognize those submarines almost anywhere. Every pump, every valve, even how their toilets flush was now stored in NATO's database. Russian state media spun the incident as a successful intelligence-gathering mission. Sure, and the Titanic successfully tested its ice detection capabilities. They learned that the Norwegian Sea is less contested waters and more NATO swimming pool. The overall lesson was simple, but brutal. You can build all the advanced submarines you want, but if you cannot handle 2 days of democracy's greatest hits, played over active sonar, maybe do not go into the deep end next time. Bye for now.